The tragedy surrounding Heather O'Rourke was spoken about in hushed tones for decades, as if Hollywood was afraid of what would come up if anybody dug too deep. But now, a man who grew up inside the industry, Ron Howard, has finally broken his long silence. His words, subtle but sharp, have reopened painful questions about how a 12-year-old girl could rise so quickly, shine so brightly, and then be gone before the world even understood what happened. What he suggests about Heather's final months has many wondering whether her death was truly unavoidable or quietly ignored. Before the world knew her as Carolyn Freeling, the little girl whose voice could freeze an entire generation, Heather O'Rourke was simply a child growing up in San Diego. Born on December 27, 1975, to Kathleen and Michael O'Rourke, she lived in a modest home where money was tight, love was plenty, and Hollywood was a far-off dream. Her parents divorced in 1981, forcing Kathleen to move Heather and her older sister Tammy into a trailer park in Anaheim. Life was not glamorous, but the family was close, and Heather's future seemed destined to unfold far from cameras and soundstages. Everything changed in 1980 when 5-year-old Heather visited the MGM lot, while Tammy was filming Pennies from Heaven. Steven Spielberg, finishing lunch in the studio commissary, spotted the quiet blonde child and approached the family minutes later, convinced he had found the exact little girl he needed for his next film, Poltergeist. Heather froze during her first audition, unfamiliar with acting or the pressure of casting rooms. But when Spielberg asked her to scream, her voice hit the walls with such raw fear and emotion that he hired her on the spot. She beat out Drew Barrymore, who was instead sent to audition for E.T. By the time Poltergeist opened in June of 1982, Heather was an overnight sensation. The offers rolled in: commercials, guest shots, series work. She became Heather Pfister on Happy Days, shared scenes with Linda Pearl and Henry Winkler, and grew into one of the most recognizable child actors on television. Off-screen, she tried to stay normal, attending Big Bear Elementary School, where she had been president of her 5th grade class. But even then, the pressures of celebrity were quietly reshaping her life. The long hours on set, the relentless travel, a family growing increasingly dependent on the income of a little girl, they all began to take their toll. As Heather's fame grew, so did the unspoken pressures surrounding her. To millions, she was the radiant child who delivered the unforgettable line, "They're here." Behind the scenes, however, the workload placed on her small shoulders was far heavier than anyone realized. Hollywood in the 1980s was not equipped to protect child actors. Regulations were looser, schedules harsher, and often studios prioritized deadlines over well-being. Heather, sweet, polite, and eager to please, fit perfectly into a system that rewarded silence and discouraged anything that slowed production. In the summer of 1985, it was time to film Poltergeist 2. Heather was now performing adult hours camouflaged in child-friendly days. Don't be out too late. Have a nap. The cumulative effect of the emotional scenes, rehearsals, hours of waiting on set, and always having to be cheerful and professional was now catching up. Her mother, Kathleen, made sure that tutors were on set and went with her to the shoots. But the reality was, the family needed Heather's money. If Heather rested, the household suffered. By 1986, subtle signs indicated that something was amiss. Heather's energy sagged, and she sometimes complained of stomach pain and exhaustion, though she rarely pushed back against studio demands. When she picked up giardiasis from contaminated well water at Big Bear Lake, the symptoms were written off as minor. Later, when her face swelled due to cortisone treatments prescribed for what doctors mistakenly believed was Crohn's disease, she quietly accepted it. She was told this was part of her job, something she had to push through. Her co-workers on set would note that she'd grow pale between takes or ask for water more often, but she never complained loud enough to halt production. A child who never wanted to disappoint, Heather kept working even as her body began signaling that something was amiss. Those were the early warnings, but Hollywood kept moving. Scripts kept coming, and Heather kept showing up, smiling for cameras that had no idea how much pain she hid behind her eyes. By late 1987, the signs could no longer be ignored. Heather had just wrapped Poltergeist 3 in June, but she didn't look well. Her cheeks were swollen, her energy faded quickly, and she often clutched her stomach as if trying to hide the pain. Doctors insisted she was dealing with Crohn's disease, a diagnosis that would soon prove devastatingly wrong. They prescribed cortisone, a powerful medication for a child, and assured her family she simply needed rest. But rest was something Hollywood rarely allowed its youngest workers. Heather's mother grew more and more afraid as Heather's symptoms worsened. She had always been such a lively, talkative child, but Heather started shutting herself off, growing too tired even to play with friends anymore. She missed days of school, which frustrated her, because being class president made her feel responsible for her fellow students. Still, she toughed it out and battled on. To the world outside her inner circle, she was still the bright star they had grown to love, but nothing could be further from the truth. Inside the O'Rourke home, fear was slowly taking shape. January 31st, 1988, Super Bowl Sunday, became the breaking point. Heather spent all day vomiting every few hours, growing pale and exhausted. Her mother tried to hydrate her with Gatorade, believing it might stabilize her. By the next morning, Heather insisted she felt well enough to go to school, but when Kathleen made breakfast, Heather suddenly choked on her toast and whispered that she couldn't swallow. Then her fingers and toes began turning blue, and her breathing changed. Within minutes, Kathleen knew they were facing a medical crisis far deeper than the flu or Crohn's disease. As Kathleen rushed her toward the car, Heather collapsed. Paramedics managed to revive her once, but her condition remained critical. She was taken first to El Cajon Community Hospital and then flown to the Children's Hospital of San Diego, where surgeons finally discovered the truth. Heather had a congenital intestinal blockage that had gone undetected her whole life. The infection had ruptured through her system, causing massive septic shock. She was rushed into emergency surgery, but her small body was already losing the fight. At 2:43 p.m. on February 1st, 1988, just weeks after her 12th birthday, Heather O'Rourke was pronounced dead. Hollywood lost a rising star, a family lost a daughter, and the world lost a child it never truly got the chance to know. Blame, grief, and a mother determined not to stay silent followed. The news of Heather's death moved through Hollywood with brutal speed. She was young, beloved, and there had been no indication of the catastrophic condition that killed her. The public could not seem to swallow the coroner's explanation. How could a child who had access to some of the best doctors in California die of a congenital intestinal blockage that no one had found? And why had she been misdiagnosed with Crohn's disease, an illness she never had? Devastated but resolute, Kathleen O'Rourke refused to let her daughter's story end without answers. In May 1988, just 3 months after Heather's death, she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Kaiser Foundation Hospital of San Diego and the Southern California Permanente Medical Group. Her claim was simple but devastating. Kaiser had failed her child. According to Kathleen, X-rays taken a year earlier should have revealed the narrowing in Heather's intestines. If the doctors had properly read those films, she believed her daughter would still be alive. The lawsuit set off a storm of debate. Kaiser defended its physicians, saying their diagnosis and treatment were proper, and that Heather's condition had been unusually silent. Specialists vigorously disagreed. Dr. Daniel Hollander, chief of gastroenterology at UC Irvine, said publicly that Heather's death was singularly unusual, and that congenital stenosis usually generates symptoms apparent throughout childhood. His comments fanned speculation that crucial signs had been missed, signs that should never have been missed. Meanwhile, the marketing behind Poltergeist 3 was an ethical nightmare. Heather's death had happened a mere 4 months before the film's scheduled June 1988 release. Studio executives were reluctant to promote it out of fear of accusations of exploiting her tragedy. Co-stars Tom Skerritt and Nancy Allen were discouraged from giving interviews to avoid any questions about the circumstances surrounding her death. When the film finally hit theaters, it carried a dedication to Heather, a gesture of respect that did little to lessen the unease surrounding the project. Inside the O'Rourke home, grief was thick in the air. Heather had been more than just a child star. She was the family's joy, their pride, and their anchor. Losing her did not only rip them apart emotionally, but it also destroyed a future they felt they were building together. As Hollywood fell silent, Another figure came forward, one who knew better than most the pressures of being thrust into stardom as a child. Finally, Ron Howard spoke, and his words cut deeply. People in the industry had kept their distance from the controversy surrounding Heather's death for years. Silence was safer. Hollywood had always preferred silence to uncomfortable truths. Eventually, Ron Howard, who, long before he was a director, had grown up in front of cameras, broke that silence. His comments, measured but unmistakably pointed, reopened wounds the industry hoped had faded. Howard had worked with Heather when she was on Happy Days and remembered her as bright, eager, and endlessly polite, qualities Hollywood often exploited in children. He didn't hide behind the usual expressions of sorrow decades later when asked about her passing. He spoke of the industry itself and how it treated children like Heather. She was overworked, he said quietly. There were too many expectations placed on someone her age. I think about her a lot. Those 7 words, she was overworked, hit harder than any dramatic accusation. Howard didn't name names. He didn't point directly at producers, directors, or studio executives. He didn't have to. Coming from someone as careful and respected as Ron Howard, even a subdued statement carried enormous weight. He had lived the life of a child actor himself, knew the long hours, the unforgiving schedules, and the relentless expectations. And he knew how easily a young performer could be pushed beyond their limits, because adults believed a smile meant they were okay. Here is your text rewritten to flow smoothly in clear paragraphs, with no special formatting. Howard's comments revived an uncomfortable question. Did Hollywood ignore the signs? Heather had been visibly ill during the filming of Poltergeist 3. Her face was swollen from cortisone, her energy was fading, and her health was deteriorating in ways that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Yet she kept working. Cameras kept rolling. Deadlines remained more important than the pain of a child. Howard never accused anyone of causing Heather's death, but he made one thing clear. Hollywood, driven by profit and momentum, had failed to protect her. His words forced many to wonder if her tragedy was merely the result of illness or the result of a system that treated a 12-year-old like a replaceable adult. Ron Howard's words did more than reopen old wounds. They forced fans and industry insiders to confront a truth many had suspected for decades. Heather O'Rourke didn't just fall victim to a rare medical condition, but also to an industry that wanted much more from her than any child should ever have been expected to give. And yet, she continued to show up time after time, perform, and shoulder the weight of an entire franchise because nobody around her ever expected her to say, "I can't." After she had died, Hollywood moved on, but the public didn't. Fans publicly mourned her as if they had lost a family member of their own. Vigils were held. Letters poured in. Newspapers revisited her story, trying to make sense of it all. How could a bright, seemingly healthy child just vanish like that? When Poltergeist 3 came out 4 months later, dedicated to Heather's memory, audiences watched it through an entirely different lens. Every scene with her in it felt weighted. Every smile was tinged with tragedy. In the years that followed, conspiracy theories swirled. Some blamed the so-called poltergeist curse. Others pointed to malpractice. Some believed the studio should have intervened sooner. But beneath all the speculation was one fact no one could deny. Heather's death was preventable. A congenital intestinal stenosis does not appear overnight. Symptoms had been there. Doctors misread them, and a little girl paid the price. Kathleen O'Rourke's lawsuit brought accountability, while ultimately settling out of court. Tammy O'Rourke, Heather's sister, avoided the limelight for many years, speaking through her own daughter decades later to confirm the medical fact about Heather's death. And in 2024, the documentary Heather O'Rourke, She Was Here renews public interest and assembles family members and co-stars Craig T. Nelson and Jo Beth Williams to remember the child taken prematurely. Today, Heather's story remains one of Hollywood's most painful reminders of how fragile child stardom can be. She was talented, disciplined, and adored by millions. But talent and love were not enough to protect her from a system that failed to listen when her body was desperately trying to speak. In the end, Ron Howard's message stands as both a warning and a plea. If Hollywood cannot protect its youngest stars, tragedies like Heather's will never truly stop.